Patrick's research is focused on travel demand modeling and the study of impact of emerging modes of mobility. Mashrur's research interest is focused on transit demand modeling. Thank you both for being a part of our seminar series, and we can wait to hear your presentation.
Thank you, Yasir, very much for giving me the floor. Hi, everyone. I'm Sheikh Mohammed Mashrur. As Yasir said, I'm a PhD student, and I'm supervised by Professor Dr. Khandakar Nur Habib. And as you know, that COVID-19 has impacted the transportation system in a way that we did not predict it. So it also impacted the transit very much. So having said that, our project was to observe how it impacted, to what extent it will be impacted by the pandemic. So this was a project undertaken by our group, and I'm very much happy to present our preliminary analysis with you all. So we know that Toronto has the highest transit ridership amongst many major Canadian cities. Also, the public transit ridership was on the rise in the recent years. It's also supported by our Stats Canada. But however, due to COVID, TTC observed 85% drop in transit ridership, which is very much worrying for us. Like it had the it has the transit ridership, but dropped due to COVID. So we were worried, will the pandemic has impact people's choices on choosing transit? And it is a very much important question for both the transit agencies to understand how people are reacting to the pandemic and what could be done to assure them that the transit is safer in tackling issues, health issues concerning pandemic. So with that, on these questions, we tried to design our survey, and we plan to conduct the survey with a main focus on 4 topics: location, scheduling, and my part is transit. And next portion, Patrick will talk about the emerging technologies that impacted. So for my survey, we conducted mainly focused on the transit choices, how people behave towards transit, and our survey was conducted in the GTA. It was on July that we commenced the survey, and we got almost 1,000 responses, complete responses from GTA. So the primary goals was to understand what is the current status of transit behavior of this in the GTA residents. So what they were thinking, and to what degree COVID has impacted the transit demand. And also transit policies, the transit agencies was thinking of many policies to ensure safety. So we were also interested in seeing acceptance of policies by the users to use transit again. So as you can see in this picture, the histogram defines the daily number of cases in timeline, and also the mobility of different modes, mainly transit, active transport, and driving. You can see just after the lockdown, the transit ridership dropped significantly, almost by 80% within 1 month. However, with time, even though the other modes like driving, active transport recovered, but the pace transit is recovering is very much slow. And at the time of the data collection, we saw that it just recovered only 30%. So we started designing our survey on May. Then the other survey. Then from 10 to 22nd July, we collected data from a panel data. company. It was web-based questionnaire survey conducted. And for the survey, we have tried to capture the socioeconomic and household information, also pandemic-related information, how pandemic influenced their daily behavior, daily how they perceive pandemic. Also the travel, how they travel during the pandemic and before the pandemic. And due to the COVID, how the usage was affected. And furthermore, we tried to look into their perception on what they're thinking in future when COVID-19 pandemic will be improved by the vaccination or at different stages. And lastly, we did some stated preference experiments just to understand how people fear of the pandemic and how they choose their mode for their daily trip. And these are the socioeconomic stats we have from our data. And we can see that the distribution are somewhat matched with our census data. However, the Toronto residents and the females are overpopulated in our set, and also people having more income is overpopulated in our data set. However, I see the primary travel mode of the commuting trips and compare it with census data prior to the COVID-19, we see that distribution are somewhat same. And in our data set, we observed that more than 80% have access to private vehicles, either as a passenger or he or she is driving by himself or herself. Also has the driving licenses. So we also tried to observe how their employment changed due to the COVID-19. As you can see that more than 20% of the respondents have shifted their work from workplace to their work from home. So it's a slash commuting trip that we could say. And if even in the data collection period, we observed that there are also 43% commuting trips. So we try to understand how to do their mode for these trips. Next, we come to start to analyze the travel behavior. First, we like to capture how people perceive safety choose their mode considering the safety. So obviously people chose the private vehicle as more safer than comes the taxi or ride hailing, and then comes the transit. So Patrick will more talk about the ride hailing perception choice. I will more focused on the transit. So if you see the heat map, we see that among the transit vehicles, subway seems least safe, perceived least safe by the respondents because of the crowding at the station and the vehicles and some other related issues where the social distancing is very much hard to practice. And then we try to understand their modes, what modes they choose for different trips. So we concerned about two groups, respondents having car and respondents having no car. So for respondents having car, we saw that as usual, they mostly use a private vehicle for their commuting trips prior to COVID. But after the COVID, we see that the public transit ridership is dropped significantly for respondents having car. Whereas if we see the in case of respondents having no car, they mostly use public transit. They're still using transit, but with less usage. However, the ride-hailing options are more used by the respondents having access to no private vehicle. Later, we try to understand respondents who have used public transit for commuting trips. And now, due to the pandemic, shifted their modes, other modes. So, which mode they shifted to? So, for obviously, people having car, are mostly switched to their own car, using their car, and having no car, respondents having no car, they are mostly switched to active transport or taxi, ride hailing, or other modes available. And if we see the same diagram for same groups of people for the shopping trips, we see that people having respondents having car mostly use their private cars and didn't change during the COVID situation. It remains the same. And for the people respondents having no car, they mostly use the active transport during prior to COVID-19, and it remained the same for even after because they use the active transport, so it remained the same. But however, public transport also usage decreased by the chosen option by the respondents. And we also try to do the same analogy, like for people move to switch to which mode from public transit. If they change their mode due to COVID, we saw that if people having no car, they're mostly shift to active transport and the ride-hailing options for respondents having no car. And for other trips, similar trend was observed for the respondents having a car. And if we see that for respondents having no car, we see that significant people are not using transit for other trips, which is obvious that they're not making unnecessary trips, or if they do, they are more not using options for the transit. They're more into choosing ride-hailing options. Also, the active transport is also there for them if they're during the data collection period. So as you see, the final for the other trips, we see that people respondents having no car mostly use the active transport, but they are using taxi or ride-hailing or carpool. And so we also try to analyze that how what are the reasons for shifting from public transport. We ask them that we try to incorporate as many options that we have, and we found that there are the most reason is that they are traveling less, and also the crowding issues and consciousness about their health and social distancing are the key point for they're not choosing transit. So, however, it's not that it's a good indicator for policymakers that it's not the unreliability of the public transit that is questioned. It's just the safety concern that they have. So they have to, while they do the policy, people have to reassure that their health safety is concerned. Issues are addressed by the policy. And now, if we move into more focused on the transit usage, we see that almost 40% of people, respondents, didn't take any trip during the pandemic. And even though we know that the transit usage has dropped significantly. And if we do, we further did analysis to see the drop according to the Socio-economic Statistics. We observed that female, the drop is significant. Almost 50% of female using less transit than they used to. It's obvious. I think they mostly used transit before, but they don't feel safer now. And for age, we see that as the age is increasing, the transit usage is decreasing. The highest is the above the age 54, which is obvious that as we know from different research that these are the groups which are most vulnerable to COVID-19, and they're trying to avoid place crowding places. And also, we see that having highest income has also an influencing factor for shifting to other modes, because with high income they have the highest, they have more options to choose from, whereas for the low income there's less options. Even though the drop is significant, it's almost for nearly 50%. Same was observed for respondents having different kind of mobility tools, has the highest drop for license, driving license, and private access to private vehicles. For employment status, we see that people working from home, they're using less transit. However, people still going to workplace due to COVID, they're also trying to avoid transit, as you see that they're shifting to active transit and transit taxi or ride hailing for the trips. And later we tried to understand about their perceptions of the policies, transit policies to address the safety issues posed by the COVID-19. We tried to incorporate the policies that we observed at different major cities around the world, and we observed that many of them were optimistic about the policies. Many of that face covering and distancing restricted social distancing on board and hand sanitizer are the most prominent ones to be accepted by the transit, the users or the commuters. Later, we asked them at what stage they would like to come back to using transit, and it's a good indicator that we observed that respondents are willing to come back either at different stages depending on how cautious they are, how they're concerned about the health, but they are inclined to using transit again. Also, we asked a question like if they, due to the COVID, are they not inclined to using transit again? We observed that almost 50% disagree to that notion that they're disagreeing that they will never use public transit again. So that means they're not transit is not the transit options is always there, and we have to work on it. So if we work on it, we can recover the transit demand that we lost. So later, we asked respondents, those who chose that they have some questions about, they have concern to shift to other modes rather than transit, which mode they would like to switch to. This is the obvious response that we found. Having access to private vehicle, they're more into switch to their own car. And for respondents having no car, they're mostly trying to use walk or cycle to their car for their commuting trips. It's a good, it's another indication that respondents are more likely to choose their location, home locations, which is within walking distance of their school or school trips or their work location due to the COVID. And almost 20% just chose to buy a new car as the health concern posed by the COVID-19. We're having the statistics. We try to do a behavioral experiment on them to understand the attributes that the riders consider while taking decisions, which is at different phases of the pandemic, and also the policies they're taking into consideration while choosing transit trips. So we did experiments for two kind of trips, which is intra-regional trips and inter-regional trips. Inter-regional trips is within the region, like within New York City, within city of Toronto, within Durham, within New York. And the length of this trip is average is 10 to 12 kilometers. And for inter-regional is from one region to another region, and we have the regional transit for transit. So the main focus of the study to understand to see how people choose and what are the factors they choose consider while choosing these trips. So for intra-regional trips, these are the alternatives that we have. We try to be comprehensive with the alternatives, mode alternatives. Also, we filtered some of the alternatives, like for a short distance trip, if it is beyond walking range, we did not consider walk. And also, respondents having no access car, they didn't see the alternative related to driving yourself or driving by household members. It was for inter-regional trips. But for this case, we considered that is the go station is within the walk access or not. If not, they don't have that alternatives in their choice set. And we consider three types of attributes: level of service, pandemic, and the transit policies. We have the more specific alternative level of LOS parameters. And for pandemic, we consider two basic attributes, like what are the daily new cases, average new cases in the last 2 weeks, and the status of the vaccine, is it available or where herd immunity is achieved, something like that. And for the transit policies is the policy that I discussed in earlier slides. These are just options that we gave considered in our experiment. So with the data set, we did a preliminary analysis of the data to see what people, what are the attributes they consider to choose public transit for these two contexts. So the model is that if they choose transit, the alternative is 1 or otherwise it's 0, the binary logic. So that's how the model was formulated. And from the intra-regional trips, we observed that the signs are with significant parameters are significant. And from the, you see that for example, negative sign, if the number of cases increases, people are less inclined to using transit. If they're vaccinated, they are more willing to use transit and other important parameters like having cars, vehicles, own vehicles in the households have the negative impact to choose transit. So for the odd ratio, it's like if one is vaccinated, which assume that from the model, it's that it's almost 1.5 times more likely to use transit than not choosing it if you're vaccinated. Same model, we developed another model for inter-regional trips. From that model, we found that the face covering has is very much significant in considering transit, inter-regional transit trips. And from the preliminary model developed model, we found that these are the number of cases, the vaccine and the mandatory face covering policies have some influence on in decision making on more choices, especially the transit choices, and also commuters having access to car are less likely to take transit trips as long as the COVID-19 is still a threat. So these are the key statistics from our study. Like we've observed that almost 82% have positive attitude toward the safety policies, which are developed in response to COVID-19, and 56% of the respondents are willing to use public transit as frequently as they did before COVID-19, if the threat is gone after some period. And 18% of respondents having no access to car are willing to shift to buy a new car, try to own their private vehicles because of the safety concerns posed by COVID-19. However, of the 81% of the respondents agreed to use transit again, even though they're returning at different stage, but at the end they will come back. They're willing to use transit again. So these are the preliminary analyses from our group that I presented today. We plan for our further in-depth analysis to have better results and insights into the transit demand usage, which will be helpful for the transit agencies to plan accordingly. Thank you very much for attending the presentation. And if you have any question, I'd like to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mashrur, for your presentation. I guess we're waiting for Patrick to start his.
Let me stop sharing my content.
All right.
No, sir, am I good?
Good.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Patrick, and today I will be talking to you about the preliminary findings of our study into the impact of COVID-19 on the usage of ride sourcing services in the GTA. And so for clarification, ride sourcing services refers to the types of on-demand ride services that companies like Uber, Didi, and Lyft offer. So before the pandemic, ride sourcing services were having a pretty significant impact on urban mobility. I mean, the introduction of a new mode and then the subsequent growth in popularity meant that the introduction of these services was affecting demand for existing modes to a certain extent. Previous work on the impacts of ride sourcing has found that the availability of these services can induce travel demand, meaning that there are certain people who will make certain trips solely because ride sourcing is available. And if ride sourcing was not available, they wouldn't make these trips. And it can also influence activity schedules, particularly for people who, for example, don't have their own vehicle or are concerned about taking transit at night or are concerned about drinking and driving. The fact that you have an on-demand access to a private vehicle, and specifically that you don't have to drive it yourself, can allow people to make more trips than they would otherwise. And the latter two impacts kind of together are why some people refer to ride sourcing services as an accessibility enhancer, in that it gives you more opportunities to travel and could potentially allow you to travel at different times and to different places than you could before. And as we all know, COVID-19 has had a significant impact on daily life. I mean, clearly everyone here knows that if COVID-19 was not very serious, we'd all be in the ITS lab. And quite frankly, I probably wouldn't be the one presenting today. And in terms of travel behavior, early research on the impacts of the pandemic and the travel behavior response to the pandemic has found an increase in the usage and desire to use modes that are relatively private and modes where you are less likely to encounter strangers or have to come into contact with shared surfaces. So this means we've seen an increase by and large in private automobile usage and the usage of active modes, which is mainly biking, walking, scooters, things like that. And there's generally been a decrease in public transit ridership. Of course, we've seen that in Toronto. And generally, there's also been a decrease in the usage of ride sourcing services. And so the main question we wanted to answer is, how has COVID-19 affected the use of ride sourcing, and potentially how could it affect the use of ride sourcing long term? And so to do that, we created a study and a survey called SISTM, which is the study into the use of shared travel modes. The study area, similar to Mashrur surveys and the surveys you heard about on last week Friday, was the Greater Toronto Area. We administered the survey using a web-based interface, and we distributed it to the members of a market research panel. We completed the survey over a couple of weeks in July, and the sample size was just a hair under 1,000. The two primary goals of the survey were to understand the impacts, both short and long term, of COVID-19 on ride sourcing use. And we wanted to specifically look at how attitudes, perceptions are affecting people's responses to COVID-19 and the impact on their use of ride sourcing. So in our study, we kind of broke up time into three distinct segments. There's before the pandemic, in the good old days where you could go out and not worry about anything. Well, worry about getting sick anyways. The during pandemic period, which is kind of this period between when the province implemented shelter in place orders, and the time where COVID-19 will not be a public health crisis because of mass vaccination. And then the after pandemic or post COVID-19 period, where because of mass vaccination, we can hopefully get back to something that approximates normal life or life before the pandemic. So we did 6 different types of data in the survey. We had basic socioeconomic information. We had pandemic-related information, such as views towards COVID-19 related restrictions and measures, views towards social distancing, impacts of the pandemic on people's daily lives. We looked at travel behavior in all 3 of the different time periods. In this presentation, we're only focusing on the travel behavior in the pre-COVID and the during pandemic periods. The impact of COVID-19 on ride sourcing use. We had a section on the attitudes and perceptions of respondents, because given how quickly the situation tends to change, the fact that we're inundated with information every day and the changing restrictions, we believe that the ways individuals perceive the pandemic and perceive risk could affect their behavior, both in their daily lives and specifically in travel behavior. And we also conducted student choice experiments to see how different stages of the pandemic would affect people's willingness to use certain modes. So before I continue, I wanted to just distinguish between what we call exclusive ride sourcing and shared ride sourcing. Exclusive ride sourcing is more the conventional service that you'll see ride sourcing companies offer. So in this case, you just request a ride through your phone and you go from your pickup point to your drop-off point. Whereas in shared ride sourcing, customers are offered a discount in exchange for potentially sharing the ride with other customers with whom they don't know, basically strangers, and potentially having to travel for slightly longer in exchange for a reduced fare. So we also asked the respondents to indicate the modes that they would use for commuting trips and non-commuting trips, both before and during the pandemic. And in both cases, you can kind of see here that there's a shift away from public transit, a shift away from ride sourcing and taxi for both commuting and non-commuting trips. And then you have slight increases in people driving themselves, people being driven by someone else, and active modes. There's also a increase in the share of people that did not make commuting trips and non-commuting trips, which, given the current situation, the work from home orders, the restrictions on gatherings, makes sense. And in terms of their ride sourcing usage, we can see here that compared to before the pandemic, more people have just not used these services. And also, by and large, people have been traveling less often using ride sourcing. But interestingly, when you dig deeper into the numbers, about half of the respondents did not change their frequency, and about 11% actually increased their frequency. And you can kind of see here from the Sankey diagram where, people who had never used ride sourcing before have used it once or twice or a few times during the pandemic. And so based on this kind of classification of how people's ride sourcing frequencies changed, we tried to understand and ask them the reasons why it might have changed. So for the people who did increase their ride sourcing usage, about a third to just less than a third cited issues with public transit, people just straight up not being comfortable or not being willing to take public transit, concerns about reliability, concerns about crowding. And the sample size is relatively small, but it does show that there is a subset of the population that is concerned about congregating in public areas and being in crowded areas. By comparison, for people who are using ride sourcing less often, aside from the fact that some people are just traveling less overall, people did cite concerns for their health, concerns about coming into contact with shared surfaces, and concerns about the cleanliness of the vehicles as a reason why they were using ride sourcing less frequently. And there are also people who have basically shifted their modes. So there are people who, instead of using ride sourcing, appear to be driving themselves or are being driven by someone else more often, or they are using active modes more often. And so to try to understand the impacts and the concerns about cleanliness on the willingness to use ride sourcing, we asked respondents 2 questions. One was, would you be more willing to use ride sourcing during the pandemic if certain health and safety measures were implemented? And we also asked respondents that in the post-COVID-19 period, would they want to see health and safety measures kept? And so what we found was about 38% of people said that they would be more willing to use ride sourcing during the recovery period or the period during the pandemic. And about 80% said that they wanted to see health and safety measures kept in ride sourcing vehicles, even in the post-COVID-19 period. And the discrepancy in these 2 numbers could be due to people just not wanting to use ride sourcing during the pandemic overall, or people having concerns about using ride sourcing during this time. But it's interesting that many of them did actually want to see some of these health and safety and cleanliness measures retained in the post-COVID-19 period, which indicate that the pandemic, at least at the time when the survey was conducted, might have longer term impacts on people's standards and their tolerance towards shared surfaces and the standards they have for cleanliness. So we also asked respondents to indicate which health and safety measures they would like to see. And so masking was one of the more popular options. The availability of hand sanitizer, it was also another popular option. And interestingly, a greater percentage of the respondents actually did want to see hand sanitizers being offered after the pandemic than even during the pandemic. Similar things for disinfectant wipes. There was also a desire to see or to know that vehicles are being disinfected and cleaned at the end of trips. And so there is the potential here that COVID-19 again has made people more cognizant of the potential for germs and or on shared surfaces when they are traveling. And it remains to be seen whether or not this will still be the case once we enter the post-COVID-19 period. But in the intermediate period now, it is interesting to see that people seem to be more worried than they were before. And so we also asked people, once the pandemic is over, if they would continue to use ride sourcing. And we only asked this to people who reported having experience using either exclusive or shared ride sourcing before the pandemic. And so by and large, most of the respondents who had experience said that they would continue using exclusive ride sourcing after the pandemic. However, this was not necessarily the case for shared ride sourcing, which again might speak to, at least at the time the survey was conducted, people being a little bit more hesitant to be in close quarters with strangers, or the potential for, again, coming into contact with shared services. And so amongst people who said they would use ride sourcing less often, the sample is relatively small, but we did ask them how they anticipate they will make their ride sourcing trips now, if they will reduce their frequency. And so most people said they would drive themselves, or they would get a ride from someone else. But also there would be an increase in, some of these respondents said they would use public transit more. Some of them would use active modes. And the last response on the right here, where people said that they would not make some or all of the ride sourcing trips, is somewhat indicative and speaks to the idea that the availability of ride sourcing services is to a certain extent resulting in induced demand. And so we also asked respondents a series of questions regarding their attitudes and their perceptions. So we wanted to look at the perception of safety and perception of risk, because even prior to the pandemic, research on travel behavior had indicated that these were important parts of the decision-making process in certain contexts. So we had questions where we asked people to respond using a 5-point Likert scale and indicate their level of, so it ranged from strongly disagree to strongly agree. We had questions like, there are more risks associated with leaving the home. There's more risks associated with using ride sourcing, taxi services, car sharing services. We also tried to capture people's response to the pandemic with respect to their activity participation. So we asked people whether they were willing to or less willing to travel outside of their home compared to before the pandemic, if they were less willing to spend time outside the home, visit places that were far away. Also, if they were more reliant on online orders and deliveries, and if they were more likely to chain their trips than they were before. I know personally that when I go out now, it's got to be for a good reason, and I try to get as many things done as I can when I'm out of the home, because every time you leave, it is a certain risk, right? And so similar to Mashrur's survey, we took inspiration from the public transit and COVID-19 survey that the geography department conducted at U of T. And so we asked people when they would consider using a ride sourcing service. And again, we differentiated between exclusive and shared ride sourcing. And so a non-trivial percentage of the respondents, again, at the time of the survey, which is a big caveat, said they would never use these services again. And a little more than a quarter of the respondents said that they would not consider using ride sourcing until the crisis was effectively over because of mass vaccination. And even if you believe that the people who say they will never use these services, again, are being a little bit hyperbolic, it does show that people are still hesitant to use ride sourcing, and that it's probably unlikely that you'll see the same demand for ride sourcing that we saw prior to the pandemic before mass vaccination occurs. And as you can see, there seems to be a slight increase in the percentage of people who are willing to consider ride sourcing as the stages of reopening, which were defined by the government of Ontario, occur. And that might speak to the role that policy and the reopening of certain businesses and the economy has on people's perceptions of risk. And as you see here, the more people were swayed by the stages of reopening than they were through the development of a vaccine, which somewhat makes sense because it's hopefully a vaccine does get developed, but it doesn't really confer you any additional immunity or reduce your risk until you get it yourself. And so using these responses, we came up with an empirical model to try to understand the factors that would influence the responses that people give. And so the big question was, again, what are the factors that will influence the earliest stage that a person will consider using ride sourcing? And so we have the timeline of events here. They happen in an ordered manner. So we have stage 1 reopening, stage 2 reopening, stage 3 reopening has occurred already. Hopefully the discovery of a vaccine happens soon. And then these timelines these events will occur sequentially. So we used the ordered Logit model to try to understand the factors that influence the person's response. So we had one model specifically for exclusive ride sourcing services and another specifically for shared ride sourcing services. And the basic idea of the ordered Logit model is that you want to model an ordered outcome, whose value and whose outcome is based on a latent or an underlying continuous variable shown with the regression here. And basically the underlying value continuous value gets translated to an ordered value through the censoring mechanism where these mu values represent threshold parameters. And so in this case, stage 1 represents the lowest ordered outcome, referring back to the timeline here. And the 6th and the highest outcome is mass vaccination. And again, we wanted to understand how attitudes and perceptions affected people's willingness to consider ride sourcing. So we applied factor analysis. And the basic idea behind that is, given a set of indicator variables, in our case, attitudinal questions, we wanted to try to identify the underlying unobserved attitudes that are manifested in people's responses to the attitudinal questions. And so we applied factor analysis, and we were able to determine that 3 latent factors were present. The first is the perception that there is an increased risk associated with traveling and leaving your house due to the pandemic. The second factor was the willingness to travel during the pandemic, and broadly speaking, the willingness to go about your daily routine even before mass vaccination occurred. And the third factor was the impact of the pandemic on travel preferences, which related to your willingness to be spending time outside the traveling and the willingness to travel further away. And so we incorporated these latent factors in a deterministic manner by incorporating the Bartlett factor scores. And what this means is that for a given latent factor, we are able to compute an estimated value for each individual based on their responses to the questions that correspond to this factor. And so the results are here. Model 1 is the model for exclusive ride sourcing, and model 2 is the model for shared ride sourcing. And as you can see here, those who do perceive that there is an additional risk tend to be more likely to wait into a later stage of the pandemic, whereas people who are willing to travel during the pandemic, the negative sign here indicates that they would be more likely to consider the use of ride sourcing earlier in the pandemic. And then there are a number of socioeconomic variables that did affect people's willingness to consider ride sourcing. Younger individuals tended to be a little bit more likely to consider using ride sourcing earlier compared to older individuals who tend to wait, which of course makes sense, in part because older individuals tend to be at higher risk for severe illness as a result of COVID-19, whereas younger individuals are not necessarily at lower risk, but there is the perception that your risk increases with age, and at the same time, younger individuals tend to be more likely to be employed in service industries and in industries where you cannot work from home. Speaking of which, the need to be at the workplace also resulted in people being more willing to consider ride sourcing sooner, which could be partially due to their other mobility options, and it could also be due to the perception of risk associated with other modes. Similarly, people with higher education tend to be willing to wait longer, which could be due to the increased likelihood that these individuals are able to work from home and therefore don't necessarily need to be making trips right now. Respondents whose household income was $30,000 or less tended to be more likely to consider ride sourcing in an early part of the pandemic. That could again be reflective of potentially their mobility options, or maybe have to do with their perception of risk as it relates to transit. And in previous studies on ride sourcing, demand for these services does tend to be higher in areas in lower income areas. In addition, the experience using ride sourcing prior to the pandemic also led someone to be more willing to consider it earlier on in an earlier stage, which could be, for example, an effect of inertia. It could be because they've come to rely on these services, or it could be just kind of an inherent comfort that they have because they've used these services before. In addition, perceptions and people's approach to the pandemic tend to have an impact on how willing they are to consider ride sourcing as well. So people who believe that health and safety would make them more willing to use ride sourcing were more likely to use it earlier. People who tend to wear face masks or to cover their faces anyways tend to be more cautious, as are people who believe social distancing is important, whereas those with who are more willing to maintain their normal routine tend to be more willing to consider ride sourcing earlier in the pandemic. And here's the goodness of fit measures and the threshold parameters. The model's fit is relatively good, and the majority of the parameters are significant in terms of thresholds. Interestingly, the thresholds between 3 and 4 and 4 and 5 weren't significant, which kind of shows a distinction between the impact of getting to stage 3 versus mass vaccination versus kind of the intermediate stages. Whereas for shared ride sourcing, only the threshold between stage 3 reopening and the discovery of vaccine was not significant, which again kind of makes sense because the discovery of vaccine doesn't do you any good unless you actually have received it. So in conclusion, perceptions of risk and attitudes towards the pandemic are absolutely influencing people's use of ride sourcing and their willingness to use ride sourcing. The ride sourcing demand, as I mentioned before, is unlikely to reach pre-pandemic levels until we reach the post-COVID-19 period. Right now, based on the data that we collected in July, it seems that there is the potential for COVID-19 to have a lasting impact on people's tolerance towards being in shared spaces and to come in contact with shared services, although this remains to be seen, and we would likely require data collection after the pandemic is over. And in certain cases and with certain individuals, it appears that an increase in ride sourcing frequency is partially the result of concerns about public transit service, both in terms of its reliability, its crowding, and more subjective factors, just including the pure unwillingness to be in a shared space with people for an extended period of time. So that's all I've got. Thank you for listening. And for reference, here's how the mapping of the attitudinal questions to the different factors.
Thank you, Patrick, for your presentation. Thank you, Mashrur. We have time for 1 or 2 short questions. And if you want, you can use the chat box or you can raise your hand and we will give you the permission to use your audio.
Yeah, thanks, Professor.
Well, it seems we don't have any questions from the audience. In that case, we can just finish this presentation series. Oh, okay, so. Professor Habib, you have the. Okay. Is disconnecting?
It is just
Yeah.
okay.
Just we can wait to see. Okay. Seems that disconnected. Okay, so we can finish this presentation right now. Thank you all for joining us and have a nice day.